Welcome to the third and final presentation, giving an overview of Control to Catastrophe CASEAR. In this presentation, we'll be looking at the Special Rules for Special Units section, and also very briefly an example of optional rules. So let's start first with Special Rules for Special Units. To keep the core rules uncluttered with text that did not apply to most armies, the Special Rules for Special Units section includes rules for things like Roman line support, elephants, scythe chariots, various mixed unit types, shield walls and schiltrons, halberd and pike blocks, and artillery, and a few other things as well. In this presentation, I'm going to look at just two of the special rules, Roman line support and medieval heavy mixed units, specifically the English longbow and men-at-arms units. The Romans are definitely a special case, given their unusual culture, their social and political structures, and ultimately their remarkable success in projecting power. Much of that success resulted from their military system, which combined their culture and socio-political forms with technologies and tactics copied from their neighbors. These developed into the legions that conquered an empire. At one time or another, the Romans fought everyone around the Mediterranean, into the Near East, and up into northwestern Europe. And they are understandably a popular army to represent on the gaming table. So, getting the Roman military system right is important. But we have to remember that historians are constantly debating how the multi-line legions actually operated. There's in fact very little explicit evidence of the way that system actually functioned in the field. So what follows is my interpretation, born of years of reading and game design discussions with people like Artie Conliffe and others. The rules for Roman line support apply to Roman legion units crossing hundreds and hundreds of years. And so there are, of course, some differences. I boil it down really to the Republican legions and their use of maniples, and the later imperial legions and their use of multi-maniple cohorts. And you can see in the statistics that I represent that using a few different hit trigger values. So the Republican legions have a shaken trigger of 6, being a deep unit. In fact, all these units at least start off as deep units, have a catastrophe trigger of 18. And then you'll notice that the rupture triggers are rather strangely 3 figures, 2, 3, and 4. And that's to represent, of course, the different commitments of lines to the combat at the front of the formation. Now the Imperial legions, they start off with the full complement of 9 for their shaken trigger, and of course also 18 for their catastrophe trigger, again also a deep unit, and with the same 2, 3, and 4 as their rupture triggers. Before we explore how this all works, I wanted to also share a couple of images. The image at the top is a very sort of fully fleshed out couple of Roman legion units. There's lots of figures there. The lower image actually represents the same 2 legion units, except with far fewer figures, and also with those figures clumped into their little handfuls or maniples, with the shield colors denoting the different lines. How you want to represent your legions is up to you. By the way, in the lower image, there's actually the Velite open order units that would have been part of the legion structure, but not part of the legion unit per se. So here we have the 2 units that are going to fight each other in this example of Roman line support. On the left, we have, of course, a Gallic unit. It's medium size with triggers 6, 12, 3. A combat and control value of 4. They're a warrior order unit with shock +2. And they're going to be fighting a Roman legion unit, a Republican legion unit, which is deep size, but with that special set of triggers, 6, 18, and then 2, 3, 4. They have a combat and control value of 4, just like the Gallic unit, but they're a massed order unit, and of course they're deployed with lines separated to denote that they will in fact be able to perform line support. So here the Gallic unit has charged in against the Romans. Notice that the units now are meeting at the grid line. Also notice that the units already have some hits from earlier combat. Now once per game, at first contact with an enemy heavy foot unit, the Romans may throw a pila volley. Having a marker to denote that the unit has its pila throw available can be convenient, but it's not necessary. Now, since the pila volley was built into their close combat system, this pila volley is not done as a shooting mechanic. The pila volley was really designed to disorganize an enemy, and so the pila volley rules focus on the target unit that must do a control test to see what impact having received the pila volley might have on them. In this particular case, the Gallic unit passes the test, it's rolled below its combat and control value, and it remains formed and benefits from shock. Had it failed, it would have become unformed, and of course unformed units, not only do they take a minus modifier in melee, they also lose any positive plus modifiers, including shock. But here the Gallic unit has passed and is now ready to engage the Romans. Having performed the pila volley control test on the Gallic unit, we can resolve the melee. The melee is done absolutely normally, but depending on the results, the Roman player has a couple of options related to their ability to provide line support. Here, the Gallic unit, gaining 2 dice for shock, has won the first round of melee, and even scored a difference of hits that equals the Roman rupture trigger of 2. Now, there's no question that the Gaul unit has taken advantage of its best opportunity to defeat the Romans. Between throwing so many dice as a consequence of their shock, and the Romans having only one committed line with a low rupture trigger, the Gauls looked particularly dangerous. Now, if the results were left as is, the Roman would have to roll a rupture test, and if it failed, the whole legion unit would break. But the Roman decides to push forward his second line to increase the depth of his committed lines and avoid the rupture trigger. This is line support in action, and the rupture trigger of the unit now immediately and automatically becomes 3. In other words, the Roman no longer has to take a rupture test. Now, with a little luck, the Roman might get even more benefits out of this. With the decision to perform line support, the Roman player must roll a control test to see if his supporting line didn't just offer depth support, a kind of defensive response, but also managed to engage the enemy with an offensive effect. With a successful test result, the Roman would re-roll his missed melee dice. In other words, those dice that he threw originally that did not result in hits. And he would add any new hits to his previous hit total. It's based on this revised total that the melee is finally resolved. Now, in this particular case, the Roman failed the control test and is left with the few hits scored originally, namely 2. But the line support achieved the purpose of increasing the committed lines and raising their rupture trigger, thereby avoiding the rupture catastrophe test. In the following turn, the Gallic unit is again fortunate and wins the melee. Here the Roman is not threatened with a rupture test, but decides, perhaps due to events elsewhere on the battlefield, to perform his last line support action. It could be that things are going badly for the Roman army, and he needs to speed up the attrition, the tempo of attrition of the unit he's facing here, especially since it only scored one hit. There's an opportunity, albeit it's a slim one. So the Roman player pushes forward his last uncommitted line. This makes the unit now fully the deep size unit that it is, but now it's reflected in an increased rupture trigger of 4. But that's not what this line support action is about. This is about re-rolling those melee dice. The control test is a success. He gets a result of 2, which is well below his combat and control value, and now he can fight back with a re-roll of those missed melee dice. In other words, all of his melee dice. With the control test success, the Roman gets to re-roll his missed melee dice. He scores hits on all of them, and now the melee can be resolved with these amended hit totals. The Roman has won the melee. The Roman scored 4 hits versus the Gallic unit just 1 hit. The Gallic unit is now shaken and suffered a difference in hits equal to its rupture trigger of 3. Unlike the Romans, the Gallic unit has really no recourse but to do a rupture catastrophe test. It doesn't have any further lines to push in to bolster its strength and its depth. It has to live and die according to its original size and its original rupture trigger. As you can see in the second image, it emphatically fails. It rolls a 6, well above its combat and control value, and is broken. As the saying goes, the battle came to the Roman third line, its triarii in this case, and it won. From now on in the game, the Roman legion unit is just a deep unit and has no more line support actions left. I should point out, how you represent your Roman legions is up to you. You don't have to have separate lines. You can use a marker to denote the number of line support actions. Of course, they can only ever be limited to 2 line support actions. But as I say, how you represent these units is up to you. I'm not going to go through all the little nuances of the Roman legion unit rules, but I do want to just finish off by speaking to something that happens a fair amount of times in the course of various games using Romans, and that is when they're engaged on the flank or rear. If a Roman legion unit has uncommitted lines, in other words, has not done all its line support actions, and is charged in the flank or rear, it becomes unformed, but the melee is resolved as though it's a frontal melee. In other words, the charging enemy unit, or any units engaged with it, does not get double dice. The unformed Roman legion unit may not, however, do line support and has a rupture trigger of 2 against all opponents. So it's pretty fragile. The assumption here is that the unengaged maniples or cohorts of the legion were able to respond to the flank or rear threat, but the legion is of course still unformed and more vulnerable. So again, another peculiarity of this Roman system, the Roman legion units, that can be incredibly valuable, but you shouldn't try to rely upon it. Ideally, you can avoid flank charges as best you can. I hope that this overview of the Roman legion unit rules communicates the mechanics clearly enough and also makes clear the decision-making tensions confronting a Roman player. Line support is a big advantage, and with a bit of luck, those legion units can usually outlast their opponents. I think that's historically sound. But if and when to commit those second and third lines is an important decision that adds character to the way Roman armies function in play. Now I'd like to turn our attention to something in some ways not entirely different, but from the late Middle Ages, heavy mixed units of English longbowmen and men-at-arms. Here we're going to turn our attention, as I say, to longbowmen and men-at-arms or billmen in mixed units. Much like the uncertainty about how the Romans fought, there is a lot of ink spilled on the way longbowmen were integrated with the men-at-arms and polearm-equipped combatants. While the English might have had separate units of longbowmen and melee-armed soldiers, I believe that certainly by the late Hundred Years' War and even more so by the time we get to the Wars of the Roses, the bow and melee-armed soldiers usually operated together. Indeed, at some point, the longbowmen ran out of arrows or the battle lines had closed, and those archers would likely have entered the fight as melee troops, but now likely in support of those better equipped to deal with melee. In Control to Catastrophe, these combined units are called heavy mixed units, and there are two of them presented in the picture on this slide. Notice how the longbowmen are in the front and the men-at-arms and billmen are at the rear. Although they are equal in numbers, this representation need not be taken too literally. It might be that the archers are far more numerous in the unit, but I like the look of these proportions in my miniature collection. In contrast to other kinds of heavy mixed units made available in the game, the legendary and probably exaggerated effectiveness of English longbowmen allows these mixed units to perform massed archery. This is noted in the army lists. Another difference with other kinds of mixed units is the exchange of ranks rules. Now, at some point, the English mixed unit will approach or be approached by the enemy and threatened with melee. Now, either prior to contact or when it occurs, the mixed unit must exchange ranks, putting the men-at-arms and the billmen in the front rank of the unit. The unit will not shoot again in the game. Now, how orderly that exchange of ranks is conducted is determined by a control test. This exchange of ranks in the test can, as I've noted, be done prior to contact during the unit's active turn, or it can be done in the non-active turn when the enemy has charged into melee contact. Passing the test means that the exchange of ranks went smoothly and the unit will fight normally. A failure means confusion in the ranks and the unit becomes unformed. If the unit waited to perform the rank exchange, it might be stuck unformed in melee. If it exchanged ranks prior to melee contact, it might have the time to rally off an unformed marker at the start of its next active turn. Now, one other advantage of exchanging ranks early is that the unit becomes well armored as a target. I should point out this applies only to units that have sort of fully harnessed men-at-arms included in its ranks, and not necessarily sort of lesser equipped levies. Now, this exchange of ranks in order to get that well-armored status as a target for shooting comes with a penalty. It loses its ability to shoot, as we've already noted, and this occurs for the balance of the game. Once that rank exchange occurs, you're not going to shoot again. Now, in Wars of the Roses games that we've played, we find that a side that is losing the shooting exchange might well have to exchange ranks and cross the ground as quickly as possible, hoping to win melees and avoid the catastrophe test that would come from just standing there taking shooting hits. You'll recall that in melee, a unit that is already at or having surpassed its catastrophe trigger, if it wins melees, it doesn't actually take a catastrophe test. So it kind of hides in the victories it's experiencing in melee. Of course, if it loses, it will still, of course, have to take catastrophe tests. But I think that this decision-making of when to exchange ranks and both the pros and cons of that decision add an interesting wrinkle in the game. In the pictures on the left, you can see first a unit at the top with its bowman in the front rank. Here, of course, it's a shooting unit. And in the lower image, you can see that the unit has exchanged ranks, which just simply happens. You don't have to sort of test to see if it happens. But in this particular case, it failed its control test, and the exchange of ranks went poorly, and it's unformed. If it can avoid melee contact, no problem. Top of its next active turn, it simply removes the unformed marker. But if it had already been charged and is in melee, or is threatened by melee, they could find themselves caught unformed and suffer the disadvantage of being unformed for the balance of that melee. I want to turn my attention now to the last section of the rulebook, namely the section that addresses optional rules. I'm not going to speak to all of them, just like I didn't speak to all of the special rules for special units, but I do want to address probably the sort of most valuable optional rule, and that pertains to an alternate turn sequence. As I noted in presentation 2, the standard turn sequence is a typical I go, you go, and I think that approach is best when learning the game, or when playing large multiplayer games, or when presenting a game, let's say, at a convention. But for those of you who like a little more randomness and a little less predictability, I have provided an alternative turn sequence that I think throws up some really interesting tactical situations. In this approach, you'll need a bucket or a bag, and you'll need chits. These chits will be numbered to a total equal to the total number of brigades involved in the game, so heavy brigades in this particular case. And if you look at the example on the right, you can see that there are a total of 10 heavy brigades participating in this battle. So you'll need chits labeled 1 through 10. And at the start of every turn, you'll place randomly a chit next to each of the brigade generals. And this will determine, of course, the sequence by which those brigades become active. These active brigades will go through the standard turn sequence for the active side. And once they've completed rallying, moving, shooting, and melee, of course, which is conducted by both sides if there's contact, once that brigade is finished, you move on to the next brigade in sequence. That next brigade might be one of your brigades, or it might be an opponent's brigade. In the example to the right, the green highlighted brigade will be the first to complete its actions, and then the second brigade would be the one highlighted in yellow, belonging to the enemy. And you simply work your way through that sequence until all brigades have had the opportunity to be the active side. This is, of course, a very different approach, but I have found that it, as I say, creates really interesting tactical situations. And since each turn the sequence will be different, it makes planning for subsequent turns that much more challenging. I would suggest you give this a try. Thanks for watching the 3 presentations on Control the Catastrophe CASEAR. I hope that the presentations supported your understanding of the rule set and encourage you to play. I also wanted to let you know that there's another book coming later on this year, Control the Catastrophe Maximilian. This is a set of rules using the same core mechanics of Control the Catastrophe CASEAR, but covering the period that is commonly referred to as the Renaissance and early modern warfare. effectively from the 15th century through to the later part of the 17th century. So stay tuned, and thanks again for watching.